The lost Persian army, the 50,000 soldiers who vanished into the desert, 50,000 men marching in perfect formation, their armor glinting under a merciless sun. And then nothing. No bodies, no weapons, no trace, just silence and sand. Endless sand. Before we descend into one of history's darkest mysteries, if you're fascinated by the forgotten corners of the past, the unsolved enigmas that lurk in the shadows of ancient empires, then subscribe to Obscura Archives. We dig deep into the stories that history tried to bury. And if this tale of vanished armies and silent deserts pulls you in, leave a like. It helps us uncover more mysteries like this one. Now, let us begin. The year is 524 BCE. The Persian Empire stands at the height of its power, stretching from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. At its helm sits Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, a man driven by ambition and haunted by the shadows of his father's legacy. Cambyses has already conquered Egypt. The pharaohs have fallen. The Nile runs red with the blood of those who resisted. But conquest is never enough. Not for men like him. There are still pockets of defiance, still temples that refuse to bow. And in the western desert, deep within the shifting dunes of what we now call the Sahara, lies the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis, a sacred place, a place of prophecy, a place that has never submitted to foreign rule. The oracle commands respect across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs have traveled there for centuries, seeking the counsel of the god Ammon, whom the Greeks would later call Zeus. It is a symbol of divine authority, of religious power that exists beyond the reach of any earthly king. And for Cambyses, that makes it a threat. He has heard the whispers. The priests at Siwa speak against him. They question his legitimacy as pharaoh. They refuse to recognize his claim to the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In their eyes, he is not a god king. He is an invader, a usurper, a foreigner who wears stolen robes. This cannot stand, so Cambyses makes a decision. He will send an army into the desert. 50,000 soldiers, some of the finest warriors in the Persian military machine. Their mission is clear. March to the Siwa Oasis, destroy the oracle, silence the priests, and erase this last symbol of Egyptian resistance. It should take 7 days, maybe 8. The route is known. Caravans have traveled it for generations. The army assembles at Thebes, on the banks of the Nile. 50,000 men, though the exact number is disputed by historians. Some ancient sources say it was more, others suggest less, but the number itself has become part of the legend. 50,000, a round, impossible number. The kind of figure that feels biblical in its weight. They carry provisions for a week, water in leather skins, dried meat, grain, everything an army needs to cross 150 miles of desert terrain. The plan is simple. March west from Thebes to the Kharga Oasis, a known stopping point with wells and palm groves. Rest, resupply, then continue northwest to Siwa. Destroy the oracle, return as heroes. Nothing about this should be remarkable. The Persians are masters of logistics. Their empire spans thousands of miles, connected by roads and supply lines that would not be matched until the Romans. They have crossed deserts before, mountains, rivers. They have conquered nations that thought themselves unconquerable. But this desert is different. The soldiers do not know it yet, but they are walking into something ancient, something vast. Something that has swallowed civilizations whole and left no trace behind. The first days of the march are uneventful. The army moves in columns organized by regiment, infantry, archers, cavalry, supply carts pulled by oxen, their wheels creaking under the weight of grain and water. The men sing marching songs to pass the time. They joke. They complain about the heat. They are soldiers, and soldiers are always the same, no matter the century. The landscape around them is harsh, but not yet hostile. Rocky plateaus give way to rolling dunes. The sun beats down with relentless intensity, turning the sand into something that shimmers and moves like water. Mirages appear on the horizon, phantom lakes that vanish as the army approaches. The men learn not to trust their eyes. At night, the temperature drops. The desert becomes cold, almost freezing. The soldiers huddle around fires, their breath visible in the starlight. Above them, the sky is a dome of infinite blackness, punctured by more stars than any of them have ever seen. Some of the men are from Persia, from green valleys and mountain streams. They have never experienced anything like this. The desert feels alien to them. Wrong, but the officers keep them moving. There is water ahead. The Kharga Oasis is only 2 days away now, maybe 3. They just need to keep marching. Herodotus, the Greek historian who would later record this story, describes the journey in his work, The Histories. He writes that the army reached the Kharga Oasis without incident. They rested there. They filled their water skins from the wells. They ate dates from the palm trees and slaughtered goats for fresh meat. The men were tired but confident. The worst part of the journey was behind them, or so they thought. From Kharga, the army turned northwest, heading deeper into the desert. This section of the journey would be more difficult. There were no oases between Kharga and Siwa, no wells, no shade, just sand, and more sand. The soldiers would have to rely entirely on the water they carried with them. The officers calculated the distance, 4 days, maybe 5. They had enough provisions, enough water. It would be uncomfortable, but manageable. The Persian army had endured worse, but the desert has a way of making calculations meaningless. The dunes grow taller. Some of them rise 300 feet into the air like frozen waves. The army has to navigate around them, adding miles to their journey. The sand gets into everything: eyes, mouths, the mechanisms of weapons. It rubs against skin, leaving raw, bleeding sores. The oxen pulling the supply carts begin to falter. Some of them collapse. The men butcher them where they fall, drinking the blood because water is becoming scarce. There are no landmarks here, no mountains, no rivers, no stars during the day. Just the sun, moving slowly across a white sky. Navigation becomes guesswork. The officers consult maps that are little more than drawings on papyrus, sketches made by merchants who may or may not have traveled this route themselves. Some of the men begin to murmur, quiet at first, then louder. Why are they here? What god demands this sacrifice? The oracle at Siwa is just a temple, just priests. Is it worth dying for? The officers silence them. Discipline is maintained. For now. And then, according to Herodotus, something happens. The ancient sources are vague about the specifics. Herodotus, writing decades after the event, relies on second-hand accounts from Egyptian priests. He says that the army stopped for a meal in the middle of the desert. They were halfway between Kharga and Siwa, somewhere in the vast emptiness that stretches across what is now the Egyptian-Libyan border. The men sat in the sand. They ate. They drank their rations. And then, from the south, the wind began to rise. At first, it was nothing, just a breeze. But within minutes, it grew stronger. The air filled with dust. The sky turned orange, then red, then black. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at tents, overturning carts, ripping supplies from the hands of men who tried desperately to hold on. A sandstorm, one of the legendary Cambyses winds that sweep across the Sahara with the force of a hurricane. And then, according to Herodotus, the army disappeared. 50,000 men, gone. No survivors, no stragglers, no one to tell the story of what happened in those final moments. Just silence. Imagine it. You are a soldier in that army. You have marched for days through a landscape that feels like the end of the world. You are tired. Your lips are cracked. Your throat burns with every breath. But you are a professional. You have trained for this. You trust your officers. You trust the plan. And then the wind comes. At first, you think it will pass. Sandstorms are common in the desert. You have weathered them before. You pull your cloak over your face. You turn your back to the wind. You wait. But this storm does not pass. The wind grows stronger. The sand is not just blowing now. It is moving like water, like a flood. It rises around your legs, your waist, your chest. You try to move, but the sand is too thick, too heavy. It pulls at you, drags you down. You cannot see. The air is solid with dust. You cannot breathe without choking. You reach out for your companions, but there is nothing. Just wind. Just sand. You try to scream, but the sound is swallowed instantly. And then, slowly, inevitably, the sand covers you. It fills your mouth, your nose, your lungs. You sink. The weight of it presses down, crushing, suffocating. And the last thing you feel before the darkness takes you is the desert itself, alive, hungry. This is the image that has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. 50,000 men buried alive in a single day, entombed beneath dunes that shift and move with every wind, hiding their bones deeper with each passing century. But is that really what happened, or is the truth something else entirely? The story of the lost Persian army comes to us primarily through Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Writing in the 5th century BCE, nearly 100 years after the supposed event, Herodotus collected stories from across the ancient world. He traveled to Egypt, spoke with priests, listened to local legends, and recorded everything he heard. But Herodotus was not a modern historian. He did not verify his sources. He did not demand evidence. He simply wrote down what people told him, mixing fact and folklore into a narrative that is as much mythology as history. The account of the lost army appears in Book 3 of the Histories. Herodotus writes that after conquering Egypt, Cambyses sent 3 separate military expeditions, one to invade Ethiopia to the south, another to attack Carthage to the west, and the third, the ill-fated army of 50,000, to destroy the oracle at Siwa. According to Herodotus, the Ethiopian expedition failed due to lack of supplies. The Carthaginian expedition never happened because the Phoenician sailors refused to attack their own colonists, but the Siwa expedition simply vanished. Herodotus claims that Egyptian priests told him the story. They said that merchants traveling between Kharga and Siwa had found remnants of the army's camp, abandoned tents, scattered supplies, but no bodies, no indication of what had happened. And then, the priest said, a sandstorm had erased even these traces, leaving nothing behind. For centuries, this story existed only in Herodotus's text. There was no archaeological evidence, no Persian records, no Egyptian inscriptions, nothing to confirm or deny that the army had ever existed. Some historians dismissed it entirely. They argued that Herodotus had been fooled by Egyptian propaganda, that the priests had invented the story to embarrass the Persians or to explain why the oracle at Siwa had never been destroyed. After all, if 50,000 soldiers had marched into the desert and vanished, it could only be because the gods had protected the oracle. It was a religious tale, not a historical fact. Others believed the core of the story was true, but doubted the details. 50,000 men seemed impossibly large for a desert expedition. The logistics alone would be staggering. And a sandstorm powerful enough to bury an entire army without leaving any trace? It seemed more like myth than reality. But then, in the late 20th century, something changed. Archaeologists began to take the story seriously. The first major search for the lost Persian army began in 1996. A team of Egyptian archaeologists, working with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, surveyed the desert between Kharga and Siwa. They were looking for anomalies, patterns in the sand that might indicate buried structures, mass graves, anything that could confirm Herodotus's account. The desert is not an easy place to search. The dunes shift constantly. What is visible one year may be buried the next, and the area they needed to cover was vast. Thousands of square miles of empty sand with no roads, no landmarks, no infrastructure. The 1996 expedition found nothing conclusive. They identified a few sites that showed promise. Unusual depressions in the sand, areas where the ground-penetrating radar detected something beneath the surface. But when they excavated, they found only rocks, natural formations, no evidence of an ancient army. The team returned to Cairo empty-handed. The lost army remained lost, but they had proven something important. The desert could be searched. Technology could penetrate the sand. And if the army was out there, buried somewhere beneath the dunes, it was only a matter of time before someone found it. Or so they thought. In 2000, a pair of Italian archaeologists, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, announced that they had found evidence of the lost army. The brothers had been exploring the western desert for years, mapping ancient trade routes and documenting forgotten wells. They knew the desert better than almost anyone alive. In a remote area near the border between Egypt and Libya, they discovered something remarkable: bronze arrowheads, fragments of pottery, pieces of what appeared to be Persian military equipment, and human remains. Bones, bleached white by the sun, scattered across a small section of desert floor. The Castiglione brothers believed they had found a section of the army, not all 50,000 men, but a portion of them, perhaps a scouting party, or a group that had become separated from the main force. The artifacts dated to the right period. The location was consistent with the route described by Herodotus. They published their findings in 2009, and the story exploded across international media. Headlines proclaimed that the lost Persian army had finally been found. Documentaries were made, books were written. The mystery, it seemed, had been solved, but the academic community was skeptical. Other archaeologists examined the Castiglione evidence and found it lacking. Yes, there were artifacts. Yes, there were bones. But nothing definitively proved that these belonged to Cambyses' army. The arrowheads could have been from any number of military expeditions that had crossed the desert over the centuries. The bones could have been from merchant caravans, or local tribes, or travelers who had died of thirst decades or even centuries after Cambyses. Without more extensive excavation, without carbon dating, without clear contextual evidence, the discovery remained inconclusive. The Castiglione brothers defended their findings. They argued that the location, the artifacts, and the historical accounts all pointed to the same conclusion. This was the lost army, or at least part of it. But the debate continues to this day. No major academic institution has endorsed their claim. No follow-up excavation has been conducted. The site remains unconfirmed, and so the mystery endures. Let us consider for a moment the possibilities. What really happened to the army of Cambyses? If we strip away the legend, if we examine the evidence with cold logic, what explanations remain? The first and most popular theory is the one suggested by Herodotus himself. A massive sandstorm buried the army. This is not as impossible as it might seem. The Sahara is home to some of the most violent sandstorms on Earth. These storms, known as haboobs, can rise hundreds of feet into the air, moving at speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. They turn day into night. They strip paint from metal. They can bury entire villages in a matter of hours. In 2009, a sandstorm in Saudi Arabia buried a convoy of vehicles on a highway, killing several people. In 2014, another storm in Sudan engulfed the capital city of Khartoum, reducing visibility to zero and causing widespread destruction. These events happen in the modern era with weather forecasting and emergency services. Imagine what a sandstorm could do to an ancient army caught in the open desert with no warning. If the Persian army was hit by a sufficiently large storm, it is possible that many of them were buried. The sand would have filled their lungs, suffocated them, and then covered their bodies. Over time, the wind would have moved the dunes, scattering the remains or burying them deeper. 2,000 years later, there might be nothing left to find. But there are problems with this theory. First, sandstorms, no matter how powerful, do not bury everything. There are always survivors, always stragglers, always someone who manages to escape or find shelter. And yet, according to Herodotus, no one from the army ever returned. Not a single soldier, not a single messenger. Second, even if the storm killed the majority of the army, there should still be evidence. Metal does not decompose. Bronze arrowheads, iron swords, armor, shields, these things would remain, even after millennia. And in the vast expanse of desert between Kharga and Siwa, no one has found a debris field that matches the scale of 50,000 men. Third, the Castiglione discovery, while suggestive, is far too small. A few arrowheads and scattered bones do not account for an army. If the sandstorm theory is correct, there should be a mass grave somewhere, a concentrated area where thousands of bodies were buried together, and no such site has ever been found. So perhaps the sandstorm theory is too simple. Perhaps the truth is more complex. The second theory suggests that the army was ambushed by local tribes. The Western Desert was not empty in the 6th century BCE. It was home to various nomadic groups, some of whom were fiercely independent and hostile to outsiders. The Persians were invaders. They had conquered Egypt by force. They were not welcome. If word spread that a Persian army was marching through the desert, it is possible that local tribes organized an ambush. 50,000 soldiers sounds like an overwhelming force, but in the desert, numbers mean less than knowledge. The tribes knew the terrain. They knew where the wells were, where travelers were most vulnerable, where an army could be cut off from its supplies. An ambush would not need to kill all 50,000 men. It would only need to destroy the supply carts, poison the wells, and scatter the army into small, disorganized groups. Without water, without food, the soldiers would die within days. The desert would do the rest. This theory explains why there are no survivors. If the army was scattered and picked off in small groups, there would be no one left to report back to Cambyses. It also explains the lack of a centralized burial site. The bodies would be spread across hundreds of miles, picked clean by scavengers, buried by wind and time. But again, there are problems. There is no record of any local tribe claiming responsibility for the destruction of a Persian army. No inscriptions, no oral traditions, nothing. If such a victory had occurred, it would have been celebrated, remembered, passed down through generations. The defeat of 50,000 Persian soldiers would be a legendary achievement, and yet there is silence. Additionally, organizing an ambush large enough to destroy an entire Persian army would require coordination between multiple tribes, a feat that seems unlikely given the scattered nature of desert populations. And even if such an ambush had occurred, there should still be evidence. Battlefields leave traces, weapons, bones, pottery. Something. So perhaps the ambush theory is incomplete. Perhaps it was not the tribes alone. The third theory is darker. It suggests that the army destroyed itself. Imagine the situation from the soldiers' perspective. They have been marching for days through an inhospitable wasteland. The water is running low. The heat is unbearable. The officers are driving them forward, but toward what? A temple in the middle of nowhere. An oracle that poses no military threat. Men begin to question the mission. They begin to question their leaders. Discipline breaks down. Arguments erupt. Soldiers refuse orders. A fight breaks out over water rations. An officer is killed. Chaos spreads. The army fractures into factions. Some want to turn back. Others want to push forward. Still others simply want to survive, by any means necessary. In the confusion, the army collapses. Soldiers kill each other over water, over food, over petty grudges. The strong prey on the weak. Units dissolve. Men scatter into the desert, trying to find their own way back to civilization. But there is no way back. Not without supplies. Not without water. They wander. They die. Alone or in small groups. The desert consumes them. This theory is bleak, but it is not without precedent. Armies have been destroyed by internal collapse before. The Greeks at Syracuse, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, the British in Afghanistan. When discipline breaks down, when morale shatters, armies cease to be fighting forces and become mobs of desperate individuals. If the Persian army collapsed in this way, it would explain the lack of survivors. It would explain the absence of a centralized battlefield or burial site. And it would explain why Cambyses never sent another expedition to investigate. If the army had destroyed itself through mutiny and chaos, it would be a humiliation, a failure too shameful to record. But once again, we are left with questions. If the army had collapsed, there should still be some evidence. Scattered remains, abandoned equipment, some trace of their final days. And we should have accounts from the survivors. Surely some men would have made it back to civilization, even if only to die of thirst or exposure after being picked up by local traders or tribes. The silence is too complete, too absolute. The fourth theory is perhaps the most controversial. It suggests that the army never existed at all. Herodotus, for all his contributions to history, was not immune to exaggeration. He recorded stories about giant ants that mined gold, about griffins guarding treasure, about tribes with no heads but faces on their chests. His work is filled with fantastical elements that blur the line between history and mythology. What if the story of the lost army is simply another myth? A cautionary tale invented by Egyptian priests to explain why the Persians never attacked the oracle at Siwa? Or a piece of propaganda designed to make Cambyses look reckless and cursed by the gods? After all, there are no Persian records of this expedition, no cuneiform tablets, no royal inscriptions. The Persians kept meticulous records of their military campaigns, but they never mention an army of 50,000 men marching into the desert and vanishing. If the army had existed, if it had been such a significant loss, Surely the Persians would have recorded it. Surely there would be some acknowledgement of the disaster. But there is nothing. Some historians argue that the story is a later fabrication, a tale that grew over time as it was passed from one storyteller to another. The number 50,000 is suspiciously round, the kind of exaggeration that creeps into oral traditions. Perhaps there was a small expedition, perhaps it was a few hundred men, maybe 1,000, and perhaps they did meet with disaster, ambush, starvation, or storm. But over the decades, as the story was retold, the numbers grew. 100 became 1,000, 1,000 became 10,000, and eventually it became 50,000. By the time Herodotus heard the story, it had transformed into legend. This theory is difficult to disprove. After all, proving that something never existed is nearly impossible, but it is also unsatisfying. It reduces one of history's great mysteries to a misunderstanding, a game of telephone played across centuries. And yet, it remains a possibility, perhaps the most rational possibility. The fifth theory is the one that continues to drive archaeologists into the desert year after year. It is the simplest and the most tantalizing. The army is still out there, buried beneath the sand, waiting to be found. The Sahara is vast, unimaginably vast. It covers an area of over 3.5 million square miles. The section between Kharga and Siwa alone encompasses tens of thousands of square miles of dunes, rock formations, and empty plains. Searching it thoroughly would take decades, even with modern technology. And the desert is not static. The dunes move. They shift with the wind, migrating across the landscape like slow-motion waves. A site that is exposed one year may be buried under 30 feet of sand the next, and then, a decade later, the wind might uncover it again. This phenomenon makes archaeological work in the Sahara incredibly difficult. Unlike excavations in other parts of the world, where sites remain relatively stable, desert sites are constantly changing. What is visible today may be invisible tomorrow, but it also means that the lost army could still be found. Somewhere beneath the dunes there may be a mass grave, thousands of skeletons still wearing their armor, still clutching their weapons, a snapshot of a moment frozen in time. Over the years, there have been occasional discoveries that hint at this possibility. In 2004, a geologist working in the western desert found fragments of ancient textiles and leather buried beneath a dune. The items were dated to the Persian period. In 2012, a team of French archaeologists discovered a cluster of artifacts near an ancient well, including coins and pottery, that matched the era of Cambyses. None of these discoveries have been definitively linked to the lost army, but they prove that the desert is still giving up its secrets. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Perhaps one day a researcher will stumble upon something undeniable, a battle standard, a royal seal, a mass of bronze and bone that can only be explained one way, or perhaps the army will remain lost forever, a ghost story that haunts the edges of history. In the years following the disappearance of his army, Cambyses II descended into madness, or so the ancient sources claim. Herodotus describes him as paranoid, violent, and increasingly erratic. He murdered his own brother. He desecrated Egyptian temples. He married his sister and then killed her in a fit of rage. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated is unclear, but what is certain is that Cambyses never sent another army to the Siwa Oasis. He never avenged his lost soldiers. He never destroyed the oracle. In 522 BCE, just 2 years after the army vanished, Cambyses died under mysterious circumstances while traveling through Syria. Some sources say he was assassinated. Others claim he died from an infected wound. Still others suggest he took his own life, driven mad by guilt and grief. The oracle at Siwa survived. It continued to function for centuries, long outlasting the Persian Empire. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great made a pilgrimage to the oracle, seeking confirmation that he was the son of Zeus. The priests welcomed him. They proclaimed him divine. And Alexander left the oasis convinced of his own destiny. The Persians had failed to destroy the oracle, but the desert had destroyed the Persians. There is something deeply unsettling about this story, something that goes beyond the historical mystery. It touches on a primal fear, the fear of disappearance, of being erased, of leaving no trace. We like to believe that history remembers, that great events leave marks, that the deaths of thousands cannot simply vanish into silence. But the story of the lost Persian army suggests otherwise. It suggests that the world is vast and indifferent and entirely capable of swallowing armies whole without a whisper. The desert is patient. It does not care about empires. It does not care about kings or soldiers or oracles. It simply exists, vast and timeless, slowly consuming everything that dares to cross it. Somewhere, beneath the dunes, there may be bones, bronze, pottery, the remnants of 50,000 lives, or there may be nothing, just sand, just wind, just the echo of a story that was never quite true. We search because we need to know, because the uncertainty is unbearable, because we cannot accept that something so significant could simply disappear without explanation. But maybe that is the lesson. Maybe the desert is trying to teach us something about hubris, about the limits of human power, about the fragility of memory. Cambyses thought he could conquer anything. He thought his army was invincible. He thought he could march 50,000 men across a wasteland and impose his will on the gods themselves. And the desert proved him wrong. Not with violence, not with drama, just with silence and sand and the slow, inevitable erasure of time. The search continues. Every few years, a new team of archaeologists ventures into the western desert, armed with the latest technology, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, drones. They scan the dunes, looking for anomalies, for patterns, for anything that might indicate a buried army. And every few years, they find something, a fragment, a whisper, a hint that maybe, just maybe, the story is true, but never enough, never proof, never the definitive answer that history demands. The desert keeps its secrets. It always has. And perhaps it always will, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some stories are more powerful as questions than as answers. And some places, vast, ancient, indifferent places, remind us that we are small, that our empires are temporary, that our certainties are fragile. 50,000 men marched into the desert, and the desert took them, whether they are buried beneath the sand or scattered across 100 miles of wasteland, or whether they never existed at all. In the end, it does not matter. The story endures. The mystery endures. And somewhere, in the vast emptiness of the Sahara, the wind continues to blow, moving the dunes, shifting the sand, keeping the secret buried just a little bit deeper. The oracle at Siwa still stands, crumbling now, eroded by time, visited only by tourists and historians. But it stands. It survived the Persians. It survived Alexander. It survived the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans. It survived because the desert protected it, because the desert claimed the army that came to destroy it. And in that survival, there is a kind of victory, a kind of justice, or perhaps just another story, another layer of myth built on top of history until the two become indistinguishable. The sun sets over the western desert. The dunes glow orange, then red, then purple. The shadows grow long, and somewhere, deep beneath the sand, there may be bones, or there may be nothing. Just silence, just sand, just the wind, whispering secrets that no one will ever hear. The desert keeps its secrets, and some are buried deeper than we can ever reach.